Welcome everybody. This is the second panel of the day in this room. At lunch we had an exhilarating discussion on empire and Brexit. And my apologies for the slight change in the panelists this evening, and that's because we have replaced public intellectuals with experts. Given that experts have been getting such a bad reputation, I think they deserve our audience even more. But the truth of the matter is, those people ended up going to India to celebrate Diwali, which is on Thursday. But so this is also to remind you that the festival theme is truth, and what better way to start our discussions on 70 years of India's democracy with Mahatma Gandhi. As you know, several of you would know that his politics was called Satyagraha, or the insistence of truth. And he came up with this word after, actually, in a way, it was not something that happened in India. This was something that he invented in South Africa. And in a way, South Africa was the place where his politics was fashioned, and India became the beneficiary of that politics. So the reason, of course, is that he has this campaign against sort of enforced or forcible registration of non-whites, but primarily Indians and other coloreds, which was through fingerprinting. And you may remember that film by David Attenborough, where that scene where he burns, starts this campaign to burn the registration papers. And that, but he's sort of curious what to call what he is doing. And like a kind of WhatsApp group of today's era, he had a kind of circular magazine, and in that he asked his readers, he said, people are calling what I do passive resistance. I'm not very happy with the word. And the answer came from one of his readers and interlocutors in South Africa, to say that, well, you should conjugate a Sanskrit word, satya, which means truth, and agraha, which means insistence. So your politics is really the insistence of truth. So in a way, it was not simply a translation or a carryover or even a remaking of a Western concept, because passive resistance was very dominant as in late 19th century Britain as well as in Russia. So that I thought would be a starting point, because one of the things we do is also ask questions about where did Indian democracy come from. It is the world's largest, most competitive democracy. Our experts will tell us more about it. But one of the debates is that are the origins in the Gandhian non-violent movement of the interwar period? This is one of the questions that at least historians grapple with it. So without sort of further ado, I should introduce first myself. I am Shruti Kapila. I teach political thought, modern Indian history, and politics at the history faculty. And this event is a collaboration of the faculty with the Festival of Ideas. I'm delighted and honored to have a very distinguished set of panelists. Professor James Manor is one of the leading experts on Indian democracy, has written extensively on it from all number of angles. He has a prolific publication record. I would not embarrass him, but you just Google it and it's there, and he's worked on all sorts of things on social guarantee, poverty, cities, South India, leadership, you name it, he's done it. And so we're very delighted he's been able to join us. He's at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London. Sitting next to him is Mukulika Bannerji, who's a well-known social anthropologist based at the LSE in London as well. And she is also the director of the South Asia Center, or the Institute, I don't know which it is, Center there, which also does these sorts of events on a regular basis. And her last book, which is quite an exciting book called Why India Votes, So she takes an anthropological view into voting, but also political behavior and democracy, and started off her career as an anthropologist of the Northwest Frontier, working on the Pathans. Next to her is Chandrahas Choudury, one of my favorite authors, and so this is my, he's a novelist and also an amazing literary critic, a very sensitive writer on India's literary traditions. He's based in Delhi. He wrote a prize-winning novel a few years ago called Arzi the Dwarf, and also has a new novel coming out in January called Clouds. But he's also a commentator with places like New York Times, Bloomberg, and many Indian dailies. So I thought we should have a journalist who's been there. A lot of us have come in and out of India all the time, but he actually lives there. So, we should ask him what he makes of it. So the panel mechanics as such, there will be time for question answers. Will be that James Manor, followed by Mukulika Bannerji, followed by Chandrahas, will give some opening points for about 8 to 10 minutes. Then there will be some moderated questions and answers, and then we will open it up for discussion. I hope you will find it insightful and a bit better than what passes for debate on Indian television. Okay, so welcome everybody. So James, all yours.
Thank you. This will be a kind of whirlwind tour of a few ideas to do with what has changed, the important things that have changed in India over the last 70 years. Not all of them hang tightly together, but they will, I think, give you something to ask difficult questions, embarrassing questions for me later if you wish. It seems to me that the two most important things that have happened in India since independence in 1947 are first the emergence of a vibrant democracy that's rooted in society, rooted to a depth that is found in very few other countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or for that matter, Eastern Europe. That's the first change. And the second change, which I won't go on too much about, is that there has been a marked decline in the acceptance of caste hierarchies in village India by supposedly lower castes. We now have clear evidence that this has happened on a substantial scale all across the country. 2/3 of Indians live in villages. We're talking about a big majority here. This is important, this change, because caste hierarchies were the central pillar of rural society and of Indian society for generations, and that pillar has been knocked away. And all sorts of interesting things happen as a result. I won't go on about that. I'll be happy if you want to talk about it, but I won't go on about it. And I think democratic politics in India have triggered a mass political awakening, even among the poorest people in the country. And again, this has not happened in most other countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Yet, the awakening that's taken place, which brings these people into the open as an impatient and rebellious electorate at election time, this has not torn apart the institutions of democracy, which also has happened in a lot of other countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Indian democracy survived not just Indira Gandhi's emergency between 77 and 79, which was a full-fledged autocracy, but it also survived the gross over-centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office under Rajiv Gandhi and his mother before him, Indira Gandhi, for most of the period between 1971 and 1989. And it also, Indian democracy and its institutions also survived an assault by the prime ministers in that era upon democratic institutions across the board. Then in 1989, we come to a kind of watershed in India's political history because it begins a period that lasts for 25 years in which no single party can win a parliamentary majority. So you have coalition and minority governments in India for 25 years. As a result of that, massive power flows away from the Prime Minister's office to other institutions at the national level: Parliament, the courts, the judiciary, the committees of Parliament, independent commissions, the Election Commission, etc. And power also flows massively to governments at the state level in this federal system as well. And so there's a dispersal of power, a radical dispersal of power after 1989. And over the 25 years that follow 1989, the strength and the autonomy and the assertiveness of those other institutions increases dramatically. Since May of 2014, for the first time after 25 years, we have a government that does have a majority in Parliament. And it's a government formed by the Hindu Nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP. And as a result of that victory, and also of the proclivities of the Prime Minister, we have now seen a radical re-centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office. And we have also seen an assault on the autonomy of other government institutions of the kind that happened under Indira Gandhi. And an assault on alternative power centers outside government. Civil society organizations, the media, and universities, for example, are all under assault from this government, this centralizing government. But the autonomy and the backbone that government institutions gained over that 25-year period makes them much harder to subdue now than when Mrs. Gandhi tried it in the 1970s and 80s. India has long succeeded fairly well at preventing religious conflict. But now we see that the ruling party is making an attempt to polarize relations between communities, between the Hindu majority and the Christian, Muslim, and other minorities. And they're systematically seeking to spread antipathy towards the minorities, towards non-Hindus. Since 2014, vigilante groups, Hindu extremist vigilante groups and mobs have indulged in beatings and murders of members of the minorities, Christians some of the time, but especially Muslims. This has taken epidemic form since 2014. On more than 40 occasions, people have been beaten, raped, and murdered in this wave of mayhem. This news, this information, has been disgracefully ignored by the major Western media, except for one outlet, the New York Times. It is a disgrace that the BBC, which used to be Indians' most reliable source of information for news about India, has now turned to reporting things like kite flying contests in Calcutta. Their main correspondent is not even in Delhi, he's in Calcutta. He's a good journalist, but he doesn't talk about these things. Let me turn to some more encouraging things about Indian democracy. India has a huge army. I don't mean the Indian army, I mean a huge informal army of what I call fixers, of people who operate at the village level, who reach up to the slightly higher levels of government, the sub-district and the district levels, seeking to obtain benefits for their villages from government programs, which the villages deserve, but cannot always acquire because things get complicated and the paperwork is a mess. There's a kind of vast array of fixers who bridge that gap and who enhance the workings of progressive programs to assist village welfare and enhance the workings of democracy. No other country in Africa, Asia, or Latin America begins to approach India, not a single one begins to approach India in the strength of this kind of political animal that is, most of the time, is quite constructive. India also has a stronger system of elected local councils than almost any other country in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. The Brazilians have a good one and one or two others, but this is a remarkable achievement as well. And the Indian, we now have recent research, solid research on the Indian elected local councils, which indicates that they can help reduce poverty. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but in fact, in the literature on democratic decentralization, for the last 30 years, we've been arguing that elected local councils have lots of virtues, but they cannot help reduce poverty. In fact, the Indian councils, it has now been demonstrated that when you support councils like India has done, they can play a poverty-reducing role. One of the things they do is to enhance, to strengthen what I call the political capacity of villagers. By political capacity, I mean four things. I mean villagers' political awareness, their confidence as political actors, their political skills, and their political connections to allies, either other poor people relating to other poor people or relating to allies amongst the non-poor. The open, lively democratic politics in villages where people turn out to vote to a much greater extent than in national and state elections. This lively political contestation has enhanced the political capacity of poor Indians. And the absence, the severe lack of political capacity is one of the fundamental, is one crucial dimension to their poverty. If you strengthen their political capacity, you reduce one kind of poverty, and you enable them to seek funding and reduce other kinds of poverty. Since 1991, we've seen the liberalization of the Indian economy, which until then had heavy state controls. What has not happened, and what social scientists all over India constantly speak of India having a neoliberal political economic order, a laissez-faire, Thatcherite dream world, market forces let loose political order. The result of the economic liberalization in India is not a neoliberal order, because politicians and bureaucrats have carefully kept to themselves far too many powers over the economy to make it neoliberal. But the liberalization of the Indian economy, the opening to market forces, has produced important results. Since the late 90s, we've had economic growth that's impressive. And since 2003, we have seen a major surge in the revenues which state and central governments have, so that governments now have much more money to spend than they did before 2003. About 4 or 5 times more money now than 2003. This means that since they can spend more money on government programs, this means that they are rejected by voters at election time less often. Before 2008, state governments in India had been rejected about 70% of the time in the period since 1980. These are horrendously high rejection figures, and it terrifies Indian politicians. That's no longer quite as true. The Congress Party-led government between 2004 and 2014 spent vast amounts of money from this surge in revenue, vast amounts of money on poverty programs, so that in that period, 2004 to 2014, in that period, wealth was redistributed, poverty was reduced, and the poorest people, the poorest of the poor, were reached by poverty programs. It's extremely difficult in any country to reach the poorest of the poor, but they succeeded in doing this in that period. However, in that period, economic inequality was not reduced. It's even more difficult to do that. Only the Brazilians have managed to reduce economic inequality in recent times. Anyway, despite that, I should just quickly wind up to say that despite those nice words, and they're perfectly true, ghastly problems remain. One of these problems is stunting. Malnutrition in India for children under the age of 5 is at a very high level. If a child is malnourished for his or her first 5 years, their brains and their bodies do not fully develop. And after that, the damage is irreparable. And what I'm saying, 37% of the children in India suffer from stunting because of malnutrition, which is to say that 37% of Indians, more than a third, are not as intelligent as they might be. This is a major loss to the nation, and that's a grotesque injustice. Thank you.